At the close of the 5th century before Christ, Athens was a city worn thin by decades of war. A long struggle against Sparta had drained its treasury, emptied its harbors of ships, and stripped away the confidence that once made it the cultural heart of the Greek world. The proud democracy that had built the Parthenon and welcomed playwrights, sculptors, and philosophers from across the Mediterranean now found itself defeated, occupied, and uncertain of its own future. For a brief and brutal period after the surrender, a group called the 30 Tyrants ruled the city under Spartan protection. They executed citizens, confiscated property, and forced many into exile before being overthrown and replaced by democratic government. The restored democracy promised reconciliation, but the wounds of civil strife ran deep, and suspicion lingered in every quarter of the city. Into this fragile peace stepped an old and familiar figure, a stonecutter's son who had spent his life questioning anyone who would listen. He claimed to know nothing, yet his conversations had a way of revealing the ignorance of those who believed themselves wise. Politicians, poets, and craftsmen alike walked away from encounters with him feeling exposed, and over the years he had gathered enemies in roughly equal measure to his admirers. His name was Socrates, and in 399 before Christ, he was brought before an Athenian jury on 2 charges. The first was impiety, meaning that he had failed to honor the gods of the city and had introduced new divine beings of his own. The second was corrupting the young men of Athens, turning them away from the values their fathers had defended in war. The trial was decided by a jury of 500 ordinary citizens, drawn by lot from the general population, as was the democratic custom. Socrates defended himself without hiring a professional speechwriter, refusing to plead for mercy or weep before the court as defendants often did. Instead, he argued that he had served Athens better than any general or statesman by pushing its citizens to examine their own lives, and he suggested, half in earnest, that the city should reward him with free meals rather than punish him. The jury was not amused. They found him guilty by a narrow margin, and when asked to propose his own penalty, his defiant suggestion only hardened opinion against him. A larger majority then voted for death, and Socrates was sentenced to drink a cup of hemlock, a slow poison that gradually stills the limbs and stops the heart. Among those who watched the trial unfold was a young aristocrat in his late 20s, a student and devoted follower of the condemned man. He came from one of the oldest and most powerful families in Athens, with relatives who had served in government and others who had taken part in the rule of the 30 tyrants. For him, the execution was not simply the loss of a teacher, but a verdict on the city itself. That young man was Plato, and the death of Socrates would shape almost every philosophical idea he later put to paper. In his account of the final hours, recorded in a dialogue called the Phaedo, he described his teacher calmly discussing the immortality of the soul with friends before drinking the poison without complaint. Whether the details are precisely accurate or polished by memory and grief, the scene became one of the most influential portraits of a death in all of Western literature. The lesson Plato drew was severe and lasting. A city that allowed 500 randomly chosen citizens to vote on the life of its wisest man had revealed something fundamental about democracy itself. Ordinary people, swayed by rumor and resentment, and clever speakers, could not be trusted to make decisions about justice, war, or the soul. This conviction would harden into a lifelong project. Plato would spend the rest of his career searching for a form of government that placed power in the hands of those trained to understand truth rather than those skilled at winning crowds. The hemlock that killed his teacher poisoned, in his mind, the very idea that the many should rule over the few, and from that bitter cup flowed a body of work that still troubles defenders of democracy more than 2,000 years later. In the decades before the trial of Socrates, a new kind of teacher had begun to appear in the streets and gymnasiums of Athens. They came from cities across the Greek world, drawn by the wealth and openness of the democracy, and they offered something that had never been sold before. For a fee, they would teach a young man how to speak persuasively in the assembly, how to win lawsuits, and how to defeat any opponent in argument, regardless of the subject under discussion. These teachers were called Sophists, a word that originally meant something close to expert or wise man, though in Plato's hands it would come to carry a much darker meaning. Among the most famous were Protagoras, who claimed that every question had two sides and that a skilled speaker could argue either with equal force, and Gorgias, whose lectures on persuasion drew crowds across the Greek world. They were celebrities of a sort, traveling from city to city, charging high prices and accepting only the sons of the wealthy as their students. For an ambitious young Athenian, the appeal was obvious. The democracy gave political power to whoever could sway the assembly, and the courts were decided by juries of hundreds who could be moved by a well-crafted speech. A young man who learned the techniques of rhetoric could rise quickly, win cases, gain office, and shape the direction of the city, regardless of whether his arguments were actually true. This was precisely what Plato found so dangerous. In his eyes, the Sophists were not teachers of wisdom, but merchants of persuasion, selling a craft that allowed the unjust to appear just, and the ignorant to appear learned. He believed they had inverted the proper relationship between speech and truth, treating words as tools for victory rather than instruments for discovering how things actually were. The deeper problem lay in the philosophical position that many sophists openly defended. Protagoras was famous for the saying that man is the measure of all things, meaning that what seems true to each person simply is true for that person, and no higher standard exists to settle the matter. If one citizen finds an action just and another finds it unjust, there is no fact of the matter beyond their competing opinions, and the more persuasive speaker will carry the day. For Plato, this was the slow poison that had been working through Athens for generations. If justice was only what the crowd could be convinced to call just, then the murder of Socrates was no crime at all, merely the outcome of a successful speech. If truth itself was up for negotiation, then politics became a contest of flattery, and the city would inevitably be led by whoever was most skilled at telling people what they wanted to hear. He developed this critique most sharply in a dialogue called the Gorgias, where Socrates confronts a student of the famous rhetorician and forces him to admit that rhetoric, as commonly practiced, is a form of cookery for the soul. Just as a pastry chef knows how to please the palate without caring whether the food is healthy, the orator knows how to please the audience without caring whether his message is true. Both produce pleasure, and both, in Plato's view, slowly destroy the thing they claim to serve. The accusation was sharp, but not entirely fair. Many sophists were serious thinkers who raised genuine questions about law, language, and the foundations of moral judgment, and some have argued that Plato's hostility flattened a varied movement into a single villainous caricature. Still, the tension he identified was real, and it touched something that troubled him about democracy itself. A system in which decisions were made by mass vote would always reward those who mastered the art of appearance over those who pursued the substance of truth. The skilled speaker could make the weaker argument seem the stronger, as Protagoras was said to have boasted, and once that skill became the path to power, the city would be governed by performance rather than knowledge. The Sophists were not the disease in his diagnosis, but the symptom, the natural product of a political order that mistook applause for wisdom. This conviction pushed Plato toward a question that shaped the rest of his philosophy. If persuasion could not be trusted, and if popular opinion could not be trusted, what could serve as a reliable guide to justice and the good life? His answer would require him to look beyond the noisy world of the marketplace and the assembly toward a different kind of reality entirely, one that did not change with the mood of the crowd or the cleverness of the speaker. Plato's search for a stable foundation beyond shifting opinion led him to one of the strangest and most influential claims in the history of philosophy. He argued that the world we see, hear, and touch is not the real world at all, but a kind of imperfect copy, a flickering surface beneath which a deeper and more permanent reality lies hidden. Only by training the mind to look past appearances, he believed, could a person come to know what truly exists. He called the objects of this deeper reality the forms, and they were meant to solve a puzzle that had troubled Greek thinkers for generations. Everything in the visible world changes, decays, and contradicts itself. A beautiful young man grows old, a just city becomes corrupt, a circle drawn in the sand is never quite a perfect circle. Yet somehow we recognize beauty, justice, and circularity as stable ideas, even as their physical examples come and go. For Plato, this recognition could only be explained if those ideas existed somewhere independently of the things that imitated them. Beyond the changing world, there had to be a realm of unchanging originals, perfect and eternal, of which every earthly example was only a partial reflection. A particular just action was just only insofar as it participated in the form of justice itself, and the same was true of beauty, goodness, equality, and every other concept worth taking seriously. These forms were not floating in some distant sky to be visited by travelers. They were grasped by the mind alone through careful reasoning and long philosophical training, and the senses were more often a hindrance than a help in finding them. A philosopher, in Plato's understanding, was someone who had learned to turn away from the noise of physical experience and direct his attention toward what could only be known through thought. To explain this difficult idea to his readers, Plato told a story that has been retold ever since. It appears in the middle of the Republic, and it casts the human condition in a striking and unsettling image. He asks us to picture a group of prisoners chained inside a deep cave, facing a blank wall, unable to turn their heads in any direction. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners runs a low wall along which unseen figures carry objects, casting shadows onto the wall the prisoners are forced to watch. Having spent their entire lives in this position, the prisoners take the shadows for the only reality there is. They give them names, predict their movements, and award honors to whoever is best at recognizing the patterns the shadows make. Then, one prisoner is freed. He is dragged, painfully and against his will, up the rough slope of the cave and out into the daylight, where the brightness at first blinds him completely. Slowly his eyes adjust, and he comes to see real trees, real animals, and finally the sun itself, the source of all light and growth in the world above. The freed prisoner, Plato writes, would never wish to return to the cave, yet a sense of duty compels him to go back and tell the others what he has seen. When he descends, his eyes no longer accustomed to the darkness, he stumbles and speaks of things the prisoners cannot understand. They mock him, decide that the journey upward has ruined his mind, and conclude that anyone who tries to free them deserves to be killed. The parallel with the fate of Socrates was almost certainly deliberate, and the allegory carried a hard political message beneath its philosophical surface. Most human beings, Plato suggested, live their entire lives among shadows, mistaking opinion for knowledge and appearance for truth. They cannot be blamed for this, since they have known nothing else, but neither can they be trusted to govern themselves on questions that require seeing beyond the cave. Only the philosopher, the one who has made the difficult climb toward the forms and glimpsed the highest of them all, what Plato called the form of the good, possesses the kind of vision a ruler actually needs. He alone knows what justice truly is, rather than what a crowd happens to call just on a given afternoon. He alone can design laws that conform to the real structure of reality, rather than to the passing moods of the assembly. This was the political payoff of a metaphysics that might otherwise seem far removed from daily life. If absolute truth exists, and if only a few rare minds can perceive it after years of rigorous training, then democracy becomes something close to absurd. Asking 500 jurors to vote on justice would be like asking 500 prisoners in the cave to vote on the shape of the sun, when none of them has ever seen it. Plato made the conclusion explicit in the Republic, where Socrates declares that cities will have no rest from their troubles until philosophers become kings, or kings become genuine philosophers. The line was shocking to his Athenian audience, and it was meant to be. It overturned the basic assumption of democratic politics, that ordinary citizens, gathered together, could find their way to reasonable decisions through debate and vote. In Plato's vision, debate among the ignorant could never produce wisdom, no matter how many voices joined in. Truth was not the average of competing opinions, but a single, demanding reality that had to be approached through discipline, mathematics, and decades of study. A city that handed power to the untrained majority was, in his view, like a ship whose passengers had wrestled the wheel away from the only person on board who knew how to navigate. The argument has troubled readers ever since, partly because it is difficult to refute on its own terms, and partly because its consequences are so severe. If we grant that some questions have right answers, and that some people understand those answers better than others, why should every voice count equally when those answers are being chosen? Defenders of democracy have spent centuries developing responses, but the question Plato planted at the heart of his cave has never fully gone away. What he offered, in the end, was not simply a theory of knowledge, but a blueprint for an entirely different kind of political order. The forms justified the rule of the few who could see them. The cave explained why the many would always resist that rule, and the philosopher-king emerged as the only figure capable of bridging the two worlds. How such a ruler could actually be produced was the next question on his agenda, and the answer would prove just as radical as the metaphysics that demanded him. Around his 40th year, after long travels through Italy, Sicily, and possibly Egypt, Plato returned to Athens and acquired a piece of land on the northwestern edge of the city. The grove had once belonged to a legendary hero named Academus, and from that older name, the school he founded there would take its title. What rose on that ground would shape the practice of higher learning for the next 900 years, until a Roman emperor finally ordered its closure in the 6th century. The academy is often pictured today as a kind of leafy garden where curious minds wandered freely, debating whatever caught their interest under the olive trees. That image is not entirely wrong, but it misses the sharper purpose Plato had in mind when he gathered his first students. He was not building a public forum or a club for gentlemen of leisure, and he had little patience for the idea that learning should serve only itself. What he was building, in plain terms, was a training ground for future rulers. The death of Socrates and the failures of Athenian politics had convinced him that the city could only be saved by men of an entirely different kind, shaped from youth by a curriculum designed to produce wisdom rather than cleverness. The academy was the workshop in which such men were to be forged, and the curriculum reflected that ambition at every level. Entry was selective, and the students who came were drawn largely from wealthy and politically connected families across the Greek world. Plato accepted both Athenians and foreigners, and, in a detail that scandalized some of his contemporaries, he was willing to teach women as well, though their numbers appear to have been small. Fees were not openly advertised in the manner of the Sophists, but the school depended on private benefactors and the resources of its students, which kept its doors closed to ordinary citizens. At the gate, according to a tradition reported in later antiquity, was an inscription warning that no one ignorant of geometry should enter. Whether the words were literally carved in stone or simply attached to the school's reputation, they captured something essential about its method. Mathematics was treated as the gateway to philosophy because it dealt with objects that could not be seen or touched, yet could be known with perfect certainty, training the mind to recognize truths that did not depend on the senses. From geometry, the students moved on to arithmetic, astronomy, and harmonics, the study of mathematical ratios behind musical sound. Only after years of such preparation were they considered ready for dialectic, the rigorous question and answer method Plato had inherited from Socrates and refined into a tool for examining the most difficult concepts. The whole sequence was designed to lead the student, step by step, away from the world of appearances and toward the kind of vision a future ruler would need. The political intent behind this education was never disguised. Plato believed that ordinary politicians, trained in nothing more than rhetoric and ambition, were responsible for the disasters Athens had suffered, from the long war with Sparta to the brief and bloody rule of the 30. A new ruling class had to be cultivated from the ground up, formed by decades of discipline rather than by the contests of the assembly, and the academy was the institution designed to do that cultivating. Many of his students did go on to play significant political roles across the Greek world. Some served as advisors to kings, others helped draft constitutions for new colonies, and a few attempted to reform their home cities along lines suggested by their teacher. The most famous of all was a young man from northern Greece named Aristotle, who arrived at the academy as a teenager and remained for nearly 20 years, though he would eventually break with much of what Plato had taught him. The school also became a research community in a sense that was genuinely new. Mathematicians, astronomers, and natural philosophers worked alongside the political students, and important advances in geometry were made by men associated with the academy during Plato's lifetime. Whether he intended it or not, His school helped establish the model of an institution dedicated to long-term inquiry, where knowledge was pursued across generations rather than within a single career. The tension at the heart of the project was visible from the beginning. Plato had condemned the Sophists for charging fees and selecting wealthy pupils, yet his own school drew from a similar social class and depended on similar networks of patronage. He distinguished his work from theirs by insisting that his students sought truth rather than persuasion, but to outside observers, the difference was not always obvious, and ancient critics did not hesitate to point out the resemblance. There was also a deeper difficulty in the very idea of forging rulers in a private institution. If the philosopher-king was supposed to emerge from rigorous training, then political legitimacy would rest on a credential awarded by a school rather than on any process the wider city could observe or verify. The graduates of the academy would claim the right to rule on the basis of knowledge ordinary citizens could not assess, since assessing it would require the very training that set the philosopher apart. Plato seems to have accepted this consequence without much hesitation. He had already concluded that the judgment of the many was unreliable, and the whole point of the academy was to produce a small class of people whose judgment could be trusted on questions the majority could not properly understand. However, while the academy survived for centuries and produced thinkers of remarkable range, it never quite delivered the philosopher-kings Plato had imagined, and his own attempts to apply its lessons to real politics would end in disappointment. What he had built was less a finished solution than a long-running effort to test whether wisdom could be cultivated and then placed in power, and the answer the centuries returned was more complicated than he had hoped. The institution outlived him by far. Long after his death, students continued to gather in the grove of Academus, carrying forward methods of teaching and habits of inquiry that he had shaped. The word academy itself entered the languages of Europe as the standard name for a place of serious learning. The training ground he designed for a new ruling class became, in time, something larger and more ambiguous than its founder had planned. Having designed a school to produce rulers, Plato turned to the harder question of what kind of city those rulers were meant to govern. The answer fills the central books of the Republic, and it remains one of the most uncompromising blueprints for a perfect society ever set down on paper. What he offered was not a gentle reform of existing institutions, but a complete rebuilding of human life from its foundations, organized around a single overriding goal, the production of justice. The city Plato described was divided into three sharply distinct classes, each suited by nature and training to a particular role. At the base stood the producers, the farmers, craftsmen, and traders who supplied the material needs of the city and who were allowed to keep families, property, and the ordinary pleasures of private life. Above them stood the auxiliaries, a class of soldiers and enforcers, and above those, the guardians proper, the small ruling elite drawn from the most capable minds the training could produce. Movement between these classes was not entirely forbidden, but it was meant to be rare and carefully controlled. A child born to producers who showed unusual gifts could in principle be raised into the guardian class, and a guardian's child who proved unworthy could be sent down. In practice, the system relied on the assumption that nature would mostly run true, and that the children of the trained few would generally inherit the qualities that fitted them for rule. The most startling demands fell on the guardians themselves, who were required to give up almost everything ordinary Greeks took for granted. They were forbidden to own private property of any kind, to handle money, or to live in private houses with locked doors. Their meals were taken in common, their possessions held in common, and their entire material existence stripped down to what the city provided, so that nothing personal could ever come between a ruler and the good of the whole. Plato extended this principle into territory that shocked his contemporaries and continues to disturb modern readers. The guardian class was to have no private families. Husbands and wives in the ordinary sense did not exist. Children did not know their biological parents, and parents did not know their children, all of which was meant to prevent the natural attachments that, in Plato's view, corrupted public officials by giving them private loyalties to defend. In place of marriage, the city would arrange temporary unions between guardian men and women through a system that amounted to state-run eugenics. Officials would organize festivals at which carefully selected pairs were brought together, with the matches presented as the result of a lottery, though Plato openly admits that the lottery would be rigged by the rulers to ensure that the strongest and wisest produced children together. The children of these unions would be taken at birth and raised collectively, with weaker or deformed infants quietly removed from the nursery. The frankness of these passages is difficult to soften. Plato writes that the best men should mate with the best women as often as possible, and the worst with the worst as seldom, and that only the offspring of the better unions should be reared. He grounds the proposal in the same logic breeders applied to dogs and horses, arguing that a city serious about its future could not be less careful about its human stock than a farmer was about his herd. Women in the guardian class were treated, in one respect, with a radicalism almost without parallel in ancient thought. Plato argued that women of the right nature should receive the same education as men, train in the same gymnasiums, fight in the same wars, and rule in the same offices, since the differences between the sexes were irrelevant to the qualities a guardian needed. This was not feminism in any modern sense, but it was a sharp break from the Athenian assumption that women belonged in the household and nowhere else. Art and poetry in the ideal city faced restrictions just as severe as those imposed on family life. Plato regarded most of the poetry his fellow Greeks had grown up on, including the Homeric epics, as dangerous because it presented the gods as deceitful, vengeful, and capricious, and because it stirred up emotions that a well-ordered soul was supposed to keep under control. Stories of that kind, he argued, taught children the wrong lessons about what was admirable and what was shameful. The solution was strict censorship enforced by the rulers themselves. Poets would be permitted in the city only if their works praised virtue, honored the gods properly, and avoided scenes that might soften the courage of future soldiers or confuse the moral judgment of future citizens. Plato writes that the founders of the city must supervise the makers of tales and reject any story that did not serve the formation of good character, even when those stories were ancient and beloved. He went further still, suggesting that dramatic poetry, which required actors to imitate characters of every kind, including villains and cowards, was harmful in its very form. A guardian who repeatedly performed base characters would absorb something of their nature, and an audience watching such imitations would have its passions stirred in unhealthy directions. The conclusion Plato draws from this is that Homer himself, for all his greatness, would have to be politely escorted out of the gates of the ideal city. To hold the whole structure together, Plato proposed a story that the rulers would tell the citizens, a deliberate fiction he called the noble lie. Citizens would be taught that they had been formed inside the earth, and that the God who made them had mixed gold into the souls of the rulers, silver into the souls of the auxiliaries, and bronze or iron into the souls of the producers. The lie was meant to make each class accept its place as natural and divinely ordained, rather than as the product of human arrangement. Plato seems to have recognized that the proposal was uncomfortable, and he has Socrates introduce it with visible hesitation, asking how they might manage to tell such a falsehood with a straight face. The hesitation does not lead him to withdraw the suggestion, only to acknowledge that the founders of the city would have to do something they would normally condemn. The principle that rulers may deceive when truth would be harmful is one of the most quietly radical claims in the entire work. Taken together, the institutions of the Republic add up to something genuinely disturbing. Private life is abolished for the ruling class, reproduction is managed by the state, infants are inspected at birth, art is censored, and the political order is sustained by a foundational myth that the rulers know to be false. Whether Plato intended every detail as a literal proposal, or as a thought experiment meant to clarify what justice would actually require, the picture he draws demands a response from anyone who reads it. The challenge he leaves behind is sharper than a simple charge of authoritarianism captures. Plato is not describing tyranny in the ordinary sense, where a ruler seizes power for personal gain, but a system in which every cruelty is justified by the pursuit of a higher good. If perfect justice really does require the dissolution of the family, the management of births, and the silencing of poets, then the question becomes whether perfect justice is something a sane person should actually want, and whether the cost of reaching it would not destroy the very humanity it was meant to perfect. The noble lie sits at the heart of the Republic, like a splinter that refuses to be removed by Plato's defenders or ignored by his critics. A philosopher who built his entire system on the pursuit of truth, who condemned the Sophists for trading in plausible illusions, and who taught that the highest goal of education was to free the mind from false appearances, nevertheless proposed that the foundation of his perfect city would be a story everyone in charge knew to be untrue. The contradiction is so direct that readers have spent more than 2,000 years arguing about whether Plato meant it literally, meant it as irony, or meant something more difficult than either reading allows. The story itself is set out in the third book of the Republic, and its content is unusually concrete for a work so full of abstractions. Citizens are to be told that their education and upbringing were a kind of dream, and that in truth they were formed and shaped beneath the earth by a divine craftsman before being delivered to the surface as fully grown adults. The earth itself in this telling becomes their common mother, and loyalty to the city is recast as loyalty to the soil that literally produced them. To this first part, which binds the citizens together as siblings born of the same land, Plato attaches a second and more pointed claim. When the god mixed the souls of the future citizens, he blended gold into those destined to rule, silver into those who would serve as soldiers and enforcers, and iron or bronze into those who would farm, build, and trade. The metal in the soul is invisible to ordinary inspection, but it is real, and it determines the place each person rightly occupies in the order of the city. The political work this myth is meant to do is not subtle. A class system that might otherwise look like the arbitrary result of who was tested, sorted, and trained by the rulers is rebranded as a natural fact written into the soul before birth. Producers accept their station because their metal is iron, guardians command because their metal is gold, and resentment of the arrangement is reframed as resentment of the gods who made it. Plato is open about the fact that this story is not true in any literal sense, and the openness is itself one of the strangest features of the passage. He has Socrates ask his interlocutors how the founders of the city might contrive to tell such a tale, calling it a single grand falsehood that, if believed, would do enormous good. The Greek phrase he uses is often translated as the noble lie, though the word he chooses can also mean useful or well-bred, and translators have argued for centuries over how much moral weight the adjective is meant to carry. What stands out in the original is that Plato never pretends the rulers themselves believe the story. They are the ones who invent it, refine it, and pass it down through the generations, fully aware of its fictional character. The lie operates in one direction only, upward from the ruled to those who rule, with the philosophers occupying the unique position of knowing the truth about a society that depends on most of its members not knowing it. The ethical problem this creates cuts to the center of his entire project. In the dialogues built around Socrates, lying is consistently treated as a corruption of the soul, an injury done both to the speaker and to the listener, and the pursuit of truth is presented as the highest activity a human being can undertake. To then place a deliberate falsehood at the foundation of the just city is to introduce, at the very base of the structure, the kind of act the upper floors are supposed to condemn. Plato seems aware of the difficulty and tries to soften it through a distinction he develops elsewhere in the Republic. A lie spoken in words, he suggests, is less serious than a lie that takes root in the soul, and falsehoods used as medicine by those who govern can be defended in the way a doctor might defend a deceptive treatment given to a patient for the patient's own benefit. The rulers are not corrupting themselves by lying because they remain in possession of the truth, and they are not harming the citizens because the lie steers them toward a good they could not reach by other means. The doctor analogy is revealing, and not only because it sets the rulers above the ruled in the way a physician stands above a patient. It also assumes that the citizens are, in some sense, ill, suffering from a condition that prevents them from accepting the truth about their own society in its unvarnished form. The lie is offered as treatment for that condition, and the condition itself is essentially the inability of ordinary people to bear the fact that their place in the world is the result of human arrangement rather than divine decree. Critics from antiquity onward have pressed hard on the consequences of this position. If the rulers may lie when they judge the lie to be beneficial, then the citizens have no reliable way to know when they are being told the truth and when they are being managed. The arrangement places the entire moral life of the city in the hands of a small group whose honesty is, by design, conditional on their own assessment of what the public can handle. Defenders of Plato have offered several lines of response. Some argue that the noble lie is best read as an allegory, a mythic dressing of a real claim about natural differences in human capacity, and that Plato expected sophisticated readers to see through the surface to the underlying point. Others suggest that the entire Republic is a thought experiment rather than a program, and that the lie is included precisely to provoke the discomfort it has in fact produced, forcing readers to ask what they would be willing to accept in exchange for perfect social harmony. A harder reading takes Plato at his word and accepts the consequences. On this view, he genuinely believed that a stable and just society could not be built on the truth alone, because the truth about political arrangements is too unsettling for most people to live with peacefully. A founding myth is therefore a structural necessity rather than a regrettable compromise, and the honesty of the position lies in its refusal to disguise what every political order, in his judgment, quietly relies upon. What remains uncomfortable, regardless of which reading one adopts, is the precedent the passage sets. Once it is conceded that those who possess wisdom may deceive those who do not for the sake of a higher good, the door opens to every later regime that has claimed special insight into what the people need to believe. Plato did not invent the practice, but he gave it a philosophical defense of unusual clarity, and that defense has been borrowed, often without acknowledgement, by rulers whose goals he would have found contemptible. Plato had every reason to keep his political theories on the page, where their flaws could be debated rather than tested in the messy world of actual government. Yet twice in his later life he set sail for Syracuse, on the island of Sicily, hoping to shape a real ruler into something resembling the philosopher-kings of his writings. The result was not the founding of a just city, but a sequence of humiliations that came close to ending his life and left his reputation as a political advisor permanently damaged. The story begins on his first journey west, where he encountered the court of the elder Dionysius, a hard-edged military ruler who had built Syracuse into the dominant power of the Western Greek world. Ancient sources report that Plato's frank conversation about tyranny and justice deeply offended the ruler, and that he was put aboard a ship and sold into slavery on the way home, only to be ransomed by a friend who recognized him at the market. Whether every detail of this tale is reliable is uncertain, but the broad shape of it was already circulating in antiquity, and it shows how dangerous philosophical honesty could be in the company of an autocrat. What drew him back to Sicily decades later was the death of that same ruler and the rise of his son, the younger Dionysius, who inherited the throne while still inexperienced and reportedly open to instruction. The invitation came through Dion, a Syracusan aristocrat who had studied at the academy and who believed his young nephew might be guided into a wiser kind of rule. For Plato, then in his 60s, the offer was almost impossible to refuse, since a real prince willing to be taught was exactly the raw material his theories had always required. He arrived in Syracuse to find a court more interested in his celebrity than in his discipline. The younger Dionysius wanted to be seen as a patron of philosophy and to enjoy the prestige of having the famous Athenian at his table, but he had little patience for the long, slow work of mathematics and dialectic that Plato considered the necessary foundation of political wisdom. The ruler wanted the conclusions of philosophy without the years of training that were supposed to make those conclusions intelligible. Court politics soon turned against the experiment. Dion was viewed with suspicion by other advisors who feared his influence over the young ruler, and within months of Plato's arrival, he was accused of conspiracy and sent into exile. With his sponsor gone, Plato found himself effectively a guest under guard, treated with formal honor but unable to leave, and dependent on the moods of a ruler who alternated between flattering him and ignoring his counsel. He was eventually allowed to return to Athens, but the affair did not end there. The younger Dionysius wrote again, promising that he had taken up serious study, that Dion's property and standing would be restored, and that conditions were finally right for the project to resume. Plato hesitated, conscious of the risks, but concluded that refusing would mean abandoning both his friend's interests and any remaining hope that philosophy might shape a real state. The second visit went worse than the first. The younger Dionysius proved jealous of Plato's loyalty to Dion, seized Dion's estates outright rather than returning them, and surrounded the philosopher with mercenaries whose mood could shift without warning. At one point, Plato was lodged among soldiers who had personal grievances against him, and the surviving letters describe a period in which he genuinely feared for his life, extracted only through diplomatic pressure from a foreign ruler. Dion drew a harder conclusion from the same events. Convinced that the younger Dionysius could not be reformed by argument, he gathered a force of exiles and mercenaries, sailed to Sicily, and overthrew his nephew in a campaign that briefly made him master of Syracuse. The experiment in philosophical kingship had passed, against Plato's own preferences, into the hands of armies and assassins. It ended, as such adventures usually do. Dian's rule lasted only a short time before he was murdered by a former associate with connections to the academy, in a betrayal that combined personal ambition with the same factional poison that had ruined every earlier arrangement. Syracuse fell back into the cycle of coups it had known for generations, and the careful theories of the Republic were exposed as having very little purchase on the behavior of ambitious men with troops at their command. Plato addressed the disaster directly in his seventh letter, a long autobiographical document whose authenticity is debated but which most scholars treat as substantially genuine. In it, he insists that he went to Syracuse out of duty rather than ambition, that he warned Dion against violent solutions, and that the failure confirmed rather than refuted his central claim. Whether this is honest reflection or careful self-defense, it is the closest thing we have to Plato accounting for his own political life in his own words. What the episode reveals is harder to settle than the simple verdict that philosophy failed in Sicily. Plato had spent decades arguing that wisdom and power needed to meet in the same person if cities were ever to be just, and when an opportunity appeared, however imperfect, he felt obliged to act on his own teaching rather than retreat behind the safety of the lecture hall. The cost of that consistency was a series of humiliations, a friend's death, and the slow recognition that the conditions his theories required almost never existed in the real world. The Syracuse experiment also left a quieter mark on the work he produced afterwards. In the Laws, written in his final years, the tone is noticeably more sober. The ruler is no longer a philosopher-king, but a constitution backed by carefully designed institutions, and the trust placed in any single wise individual is sharply reduced. The man who had once dreamed of placing gold-soled guardians in command of an ideal city ended his writing life designing fences against the very ambitions he had once hoped to elevate. The afterlife of Plato's political writing is stranger than the afterlife of almost any other ancient text. For most of 2,000 years, he was read as the founder of a tradition that prized reason, order, and the cultivation of the soul, and his Republic was studied in monasteries, madrasas, and universities as one of the great achievements of the human mind. Only in the 20th century did a serious body of opinion emerge that read the same book as a blueprint for something close to modern dictatorship. The sharpest version of that reading came from the Austrian philosopher Karl Popper, who published The Open Society and Its Enemies while the regimes of Hitler and Stalin were demonstrating in real time what a state organized around a single vision of the good might actually do to the people inside it. Popper traced the intellectual lineage of those regimes back through Hegel and Marx to Plato himself, arguing that the Republic contained, in early and unusually clear form, most of the moves that later totalitarian thinkers would make. The case he built rested on several features of the text that are hard to deny once they are pointed out. A ruling class selected by the state and exempt from ordinary family life, a citizenry sorted by inherited capacity, a censorship apparatus that decides which stories may be told, and a founding myth maintained by rulers who know it to be false. all add up to a society in which the individual exists for the sake of the order rather than the other way around. Whatever Plato's intentions, the institutions he sketched bear an uncomfortable resemblance to those that 20th century regimes would later construct in earnest. Popper also identified what he called the historicist temptation, the belief that history moves toward a knowable destination and that those who understand its direction are entitled to push others along the path. He found the seed of this belief in Plato's conviction that a single correct arrangement of society could be deduced by reason and then imposed by those who had done the deducing. Once that step is taken, dissent becomes a form of ignorance to be corrected, and the line between education and coercion grows thin enough to disappear. Defenders of Plato have pushed back on several fronts, and their objections deserve a hearing. They point out that Plato wrote dialogues rather than manifestos, that he often advanced positions through characters whose views he may not have fully shared, and that the Republic contains moments of irony and self-criticism that a strictly programmatic reading tends to flatten. To treat the book as a policy document on this view is to mistake a long argument about the nature of justice for a recipe for governing actual cities. There is also the matter of historical fairness. The regimes Popper had in mind drew on industrial bureaucracies, mass communication, and modern police techniques that Plato could not have imagined, and the resemblance between an ancient thought experiment and a 20th century police state may say more about the readers who connected them than about the author who supplied the earlier text. Plato never proposed concentration camps, racial hierarchies, or the machinery of mass terror, and to lay those things at his door is to credit him with foresight he did not possess and crimes he did not commit. What the harder reading still preserves is the recognition that ideas, once written down, travel in directions their authors cannot control. Plato's argument that wisdom should rule, that the wise are rare, and that the unwise must be guided by stories they cannot fully evaluate, is genuinely available to anyone who later claims the role of the wise for themselves. The danger is not that Plato endorsed tyranny, but that he supplied a vocabulary in which tyranny could describe itself as enlightenment. The deeper question the Republic raises is whether the pursuit of a perfectly just society is compatible with the freedom of the people who would have to live inside it. If justice requires that each person occupy the place suited to their nature, and if most people cannot recognize their own nature without expert guidance, then liberty becomes a problem to be managed rather than a good to be protected. The pursuit of the highest collective good begins to require the permanent supervision of individual lives, and the line between care and control becomes almost impossible to draw. Plato seems to have sensed this difficulty himself, which is part of why his late work in the Laws steps back from the boldest claims of the Republic. The philosopher-king disappears, the rule of law takes his place, and the trust extended to any single wise individual is sharply reduced in favor of institutions designed to limit what any officeholder can do. Whether one reads this shift as a quiet retraction or as a practical concession, it suggests that Plato himself was not entirely comfortable with where his earlier reasoning had led. The verdict that fits the evidence is therefore more complicated than either celebration or condemnation. Plato remains one of the most widely read political writers in history, the founder of an institution that shaped Western education for centuries, and the author of arguments about justice, education, and the soul that continue to repay careful study. He is also the source of a tradition that has, at its worst, taught powerful people to mistake their preferences for truths and their critics for patients in need of treatment. What he leaves behind is less a doctrine than a question that every later political thinker has had to answer. If ordinary people cannot be trusted to recognize the good, the path leads toward guardianship and eventually toward the kind of state his 20th century critics feared. If they can be trusted, even imperfectly, then the careful institutions of constitutional government, with all their inefficiency and compromise, begin to look less like a failure of vision and more like a hard-won protection against the very temptations Plato's own reasoning illustrates. The man who watched democratic Athens execute his teacher spent the rest of his life trying to design a city in which such a thing could never happen again. And the city he designed turned out to contain dangers of its own that he could not entirely close off. That tension between the wish for a wiser politics and the cost of entrusting wisdom to any human institution is the inheritance he left to everyone who has thought seriously about how people should be governed. Whether one reads him as a warning or as a guide, the questions he forced into the open have not yet been answered, and the conversation he began in the streets of Athens is still, in its essentials, the conversation we are having now. Someone you trust tells you they know what is best for everyone, and they might even be right. Do you hand them the authority to act on it, or do you insist on the messier path, knowing that freedom and wisdom may never sit comfortably together? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.